haven't seen it for for a while. So we are circulating a sign-up sheet. So no matter whether you are taking for credits or just show your come here for interest, please sign your name, right? So we can show to the college how successful we are in running the energy seminar.
Invent the name.
Right, you can right. You can sign out your Texas, your friend name, whatever. So when Lyndon Archer became the director of the Energy Institute, so he initiated this called Distinguished Speaker Series. Right? So we try to bring high-profile visitor. And we are really restricted, typical once or twice a year semester. Right? So, I want to first, thank Lyndon for the initiative, the program. Otherwise, won't be here. Also, I don't know whether Charlie presents here. Maybe he's busy working with something else. I also want to thank Charlie for as a channel, between us and the opening garden. Otherwise, here. Also, I thank Jenny. We are pretty hectic week, so she has been working really hard to make that happen. So, as you know, right? So with 85% greenhouse gas reductions by 2050, 9 gigawatt of offshore wind by 2030, 6 gigawatt of solar by 2025. New York really is the most exciting place on earth right now, at least in the United States, to be at. Right? So I often tell my students that we feel really fortunate to be in New York at this particular time in the history. Right? So our speaker today is at the forefront of this major initiative. Alicia Barton. I look at her resume. I printed three pages. What's impressed me most is she's having worked between the private and public sectors. And a very impressive resume. So she is the CEO and president of NYSERDA, also known as New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, which is basically the energy arm of the New York government. And before that, she served as co-chair of the energy and clean tech practice at Forley Hogue LLP, which is a global law firm based in Boston, where she practiced, practice focused on representation of clean energy company in emerging markets area as offshore wind and energy storage. So she also worked as chief of operation for global utility business units at Edison, where she led team working on utility wind and solar. She built our solar, wind, energy storage. And before her private work, so her work at the private sector, she served as CEO of Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, which is equivalent of NYSERDA. It's like a NYSERDA in Massachusetts. And but also I think she provided a very good role model for all the female engineers here, right? So I Googled her on the web, right? So she recently presented a forum called Women in Power. Now intended, right? Women in Power. Right? So let's have a work on the warm welcome of the Women in Power. Right?
Great. Thank you, Max. Okay. So remind me, how long, and then Q&A format?
It's about 45 minutes, and we have hopefully 10 minutes Q&A.
Okay, so I'll try and make it less than 30, and then 15 Q&A. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. And so let me see. Does the clicker work, or do I have to use that? Okay.
There's a laser pointer.
Okay, great. And thank you for those of you who are crowding into the very crowded room. It's an honor to be here with you, and thank you for that kind introduction. And I'm so impressed. You're one of the few people that echoes what I like the main message I like to send, which I do think is that New York is probably one of the most interesting places in the planet right now for hard conversations and interesting conversations about energy transition and fighting climate change and economy-wide decarbonization. There is a tremendous amount going on, and I know, I'm guessing many of you, are here from the engineering school, but also business school and many other disciplines, and so I've tried to keep my presentation relatively broad and high level about the basic strategies that New York State is using to try and drive decarbonization of our state, but also provide a model for other states and other countries, and hopefully have an impact beyond New York in terms of the work that we do here and pioneering some of the models that we hope will be effective and impactful. So I'm going to keep it pretty high level, and that's why I'll also try and keep it relatively short so that we can get into the Q&A, because inevitably I won't touch every topic, and I know somebody will say, hey, you didn't mention anaerobic digestion or whatever. There's a lot to cover. It's one of the pleasures of being at NYSERDA is that we are broadly involved all across the energy spectrum, and now increasingly beyond. Come on, you can come over this way. It's okay. Great. So, I'm just kind of curious. Actually, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act was passed last spring and signed by the governor in July. How many of you have heard of that law before today? Okay. Pretty good. It wasn't everybody, which I would be surprised if it was everyone, but still pretty good. And so this is really a landmark legislative achievement for New York State, and something that we're very proud of having a part of teeing up in terms of the original bill that was filed by the governor and then ultimately agreed to with the legislature and signed by the governor in July, and will take effect on January 1st, 2020. And I'm going to go through some of what the law does, and then also some of what we've been doing alongside the law, both before and after. And again, really try and paint a picture of, at least from our perspective, what we think it will take to hit the extremely aggressive targets that are included in the law, which I'll cover as we go through the material, and which is going to take, just a tremendous amount of new thinking, new approaches. This is a multi-decade transition that we're talking about, but at the same time, that is not a very long period of time to achieve the scale of what we're seeking to do. So the time horizons loom very large for us. We feel a real sense of urgency to begin the work today, building on the tremendous amount of work that has been done in New York State and other states in the past decades to start to prove out the models for scaling clean energy solutions and reducing emissions. It is an incredibly exciting time, as we said, and I really want to invite your active participation in this conversation, both here today and beyond, because we are going to need everybody's best thinking. And I'm particularly passionate about encouraging students and people at the beginning stages of their career to think about opportunities and careers related to clean energy and climate science and the rest, because this is undoubtedly going to be one of the most exciting and challenging fields that you could choose in the coming decades. Unlike when I was coming out of law school, quite honestly, and people really discouraged me from pursuing environmental law and sort of said, well, we passed the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act back in the 70s. We've kind of figured it all out. And this was back in the 90s. And we did actually know climate change was a problem then, even though not everyone has been ready to admit that. And so I think when I fast forward to today and really look at it, I mean, the opportunity to pursue just a wide range of opportunities in this field in terms of career trajectories is just enormous. So I'm really excited to see so many people here interested. All right, I'm going to jump in. Well, I can advance it here, I guess.
That's where we
It's the.
I had it working. I don't know what happened. Let's just try it.
You can just use the arrow, right?
Let's try it again.
Okay.
I think it just needs to refresh it, so try it, see if it works.
Try it. There we go. Okay, so again, just to start out with a high-level summary of the law, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. This is an outline of what the law does. 85% decarbonization economy-wide by 2050, just as a benchmark, is roughly amongst the most ambitious climate targets that have been enacted by major global economies. So this is something that I always want to reinforce, however, is the level of decarbonization that is recommended by the IPCC and the scientific data. So we're not overshooting that. We're merely putting into place the level of decarbonization that the scientific community is recommending is necessary to avert the worst impacts of climate change. Backing out from that, that requires a 40% reduction by 2030. That is going to be a challenging target to meet, but we are focused on that. And then the bill also includes a fair amount of prescriptive targets for scaling up clean energy in the electric sector. So it is less prescriptive when it comes to building decarbonization and transportation sector. Come on in. But as to the electric sector, it does provide a roadmap of sorts in order to achieve ultimately 100% clean electricity grid by 2040, which is the goal. To be clear, if you add up those numbers of megawatts of distributed solar, energy storage, offshore wind, you won't get to the total. There is a lot of other stuff that's assumed there. But what we wanted to do was send a clear market signal that, for example, offshore wind, which is not a part of our energy mix today, will be a major component of our strategy to decarbonize the electric grid. So all of that was contained in the law, as well as a couple things that are pretty significant, including the commitments to disadvantaged communities, environmental justice, and just transition. I would say integrating those social aspects that you hear a lot about in terms of like a Green New Deal framing, for example, is a very fundamental part of this law and is going to challenge us as policymakers and implementers to do things a little bit differently than we have in the past. And I'll talk about the Climate Action Council as well. I won't belabor the climate science. Hopefully everybody here is aware that this is not only a problem, but a problem that we're facing today. What I think this means in terms of our work and the legislative achievement is that we do hear, as we travel around the state quite a bit, that New Yorkers are also aware that climate change is a problem and that it's happening today and not far off in the future. It has been now 7 years since Superstorm Sandy devastated parts of our state, but ever since then we have had extreme weather events literally every year, and it is certainly driving consciousness and awareness. Obviously, you hear it almost all the time in the news that the last month was the hottest on record. The last decade will undoubtedly be the hottest decade on record when we get to the end of 2019 here. And, we know that fighting climate change is not only about averting those climate impacts, but it has a whole host of ancillary benefits that accrue in the short term as well as over the long term and medium term as well, including, significant opportunity for job creation, cleaner air and water by moving away from fossil generating sources to cleaner energy sources, and on and on. So we have been at this for a long time, and so just kind of highlighting some of the work that we have done in New York State and at NYSERDA. I won't spend a ton of time on it, but it kind of gets to the point that this law, as significant it is, really was driven by the progress we've been able to achieve to date. And in terms of my own experience and participation in the legislative decision making that drove passage of the bill, being able to show up at these legislative hearings and say that we had already installed substantial amounts of distributed solar in the state, and that we had done so at approximately half the cost we originally projected. That cost had fallen, frankly, by I think we're at about 65% since we started our New York Sun initiatives in New York State a few years ago. That clear building of momentum and track record of success has been a very powerful part of what we have been able to tell people. However, we clearly have a long way to go when it comes from a total emissions reduction perspective, and probably many of you are aware as well that emissions around the world are continuing to go up. not down. And New York is, a relatively small part of global emissions. That is true. And I, hear that criticism sometimes from people who question, why New York would act so aggressively or what it would really do for our state. But New York is the 13th largest economy in the world. And again, I think if we can prove the model for making progress here, that will have impacts beyond just the carbon footprint of our state. So the law also establishes a Climate Action Council, and this is, perhaps sounds a little procedural or maybe a little bureaucratic, dare I say, but it is important and will set out the important pathways for the work that New York State will have to do. So this is just, a bit of a snapshot of how the Climate Action Council will come together. It has not been formed yet. Again, the effective date of the law will be January 1st. We do hope to launch the Climate Action Council in January, shortly thereafter, or at least sometime early in the new year. And I think, let me go back to that. Important to point out that the scoping plan that's in bold at the top there is really kind of the main output of the Climate Action Council. So this body will be charged with legal authority to develop a plan for economy-wide decarbonization and the policies and plans that the state will need to undertake in order to hit those 2030 and then 2050 targets. And there will be, advisory panels on the topics highlighted in the yellow box. Again, this is going to be something that will challenge us to think about new and different solutions than we have really employed in the past for efforts across a bunch of these sectors. There is also, and I mentioned some of the other components of the law focused on just transition and environmental justice. The law also creates other bodies that will be focused on those issues. Significantly, it does require that a minimum of 35% of state funding for clean energy initiatives go to disadvantaged communities. And that is really a very bold commitment that I don't think any other state has taken on to that level of significance. And again, will challenge us to find ways to ensure that as we go through this clean energy transition, that it does benefit all New Yorkers, that it does not disproportionately disadvantage those communities that have historically been carrying the burden of energy facilities, and that for whom increases to your electricity bill to pay for clean energy funding is a particular burden. So we'll be focused on that, as well as when it comes to just transition, the transition for traditional fossil fuel industry workers to other industries. And that is something, again, that will be very complex and challenge us to think creatively about how to ensure that the communities and workers who are participating in delivering the state's electricity system today are not left behind in this conversation, and that they actually have an opportunity, ideally, to participate in what we do expect to be an extremely significant job creation opportunity. Again, a little bit more about the scoping plan and the process. I won't belabor that too much, but suffice it to say, there will be public hearings. There will be a fair amount of expert analysis that will need to be brought to this. And ultimately, when we get to the end, and I should say, I don't think I mentioned the deadlines, the draft scoping plan will be due 2 years after the effective date of the law, so at the end of 2021, and then another year for the final to be made available. So we will be actively engaging stakeholders, constituents, communities, and experts from all of the related fields in order to put together this scoping plan, which we do believe will serve as the roadmap of sorts for economy-wide decarbonization over the next 2 decades. This was the 35% I already mentioned, so I'll move past that. The timelines for implementing the law, the scoping plan 3 years out, as I just mentioned, and then significantly here, a year after that, the Department of Environmental Conservation actually will need to promulgate final regulations to implement the requirements of the scoping plan, meaning that's the enforcement mechanism to ensure that the state does actually undertake the actions that are recommended in the plan. So that, again, is pretty significant in terms of an enforcement mechanism. This law is not symbolic, but actually will be driving substantial new investments and changes to the energy system on a broad basis. So how are we going to do that? We have, as I mentioned, been working on this for quite some time, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with these efforts or with our organization NYSERDA, as Max introduced at the beginning. But we've been at this work for quite a while, and have been making progress. Although again, we have a far way to go in some areas. One of the initiatives that we have been working on for a number of years that we're incredibly excited about, but again, which will have some additional work in the years ahead to actually accomplish, is related to offshore wind. I'm not sure how many people follow this, but offshore wind has been deployed at significant scale in Europe, particularly the UK market, is beginning to be deployed at scale in parts of Asia, and currently has not been deployed at scale in the United States. In fact, there's only one project operating today. That's the 30 megawatt Block Island wind farm off the coast of Rhode Island. And yet offshore wind represents, probably the single biggest new opportunity to bring renewable resources onto the grid in New York. So as I presented earlier with the law, there's a target of 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. But working back from 2035, that means we have to really get started today. So that's why in July, Governor Cuomo announced that NYSERDA had issued contracts to 2 offshore wind farms. These will be the first large-scale offshore wind farms to serve New York. They're both now under contract to NYSERDA, and they're shown on the map. Obviously, you can see one is closer to Long Island here, and Sunrise Wind is actually kind of off the coast of Rhode Island, and east of Long Island. But these projects are scheduled to advance over the next several years and be operational in 2024. They are, extremely large infrastructure projects, multi-billion-dollar infrastructure projects. So they do take years for permitting and construction, which is why, again, when you look at that schedule, we have quite a lot of work to do to hit these 2030 and 2035 targets, which is, why it's so important to get started today. The scale is really significant. Again, just these 2 projects are enough to power 1 million homes, which, is very significant in the context of New York's population. And the other reason offshore wind is extremely exciting to New York State, and why we've invested a ton of time and resources in this particular effort, is given the substantial opportunity for economic development and new job creation. Given that the industry does not exist in the US today, as I just described, there's a huge opportunity to create a new heavy marine and energy industry along the east coast of the United States. And maybe for context, again, for folks that aren't familiar, the East Coast is a particularly good place for offshore wind globally. The water depths are sufficiently shallow, and the wind speeds are very high. So, there is an extraordinary potential for this resource up and down the east coast of the United States. And so you see, a number of New England and Northeast states pursuing this opportunity very aggressively. It's extremely exciting, but it is going to take some additional hard work to get to the point where these projects are actually operating and generating substantial amounts of power. Some of us, myself included, have been trying to launch offshore wind in the United States for well over a decade, and it has been a long time coming, and it has been tough going at times due to a number of considerations, including, in some of the projects, some of the view shed or NIMBY issues, as well as concerns about the cost. I think one of the most exciting things about offshore wind has been the falling cost trajectory we've seen in recent years. Offshore wind is operating essentially at cost parity with fossil generation in the UK market today, per their most recent auction that occurred this fall. That's an incredibly exciting milestone. And even for the United States, the costs have already come down much faster than we anticipated just for these two contracts. NYSERDA had issued a cost projection before we issued the RFP, and these projects came in 40% better, 40% lower cost than we had projected just a year earlier based on the most recent market data available. So that's a pretty common theme with renewables, again, and drives a lot of the progress we're seeing elsewhere. So this is a picture of the land-based wind and large-scale solar development efforts that we've been undertaking in New York to put ourselves on that path to 100% clean electricity. Just since 2017, we have issued contracts for 46 projects, 3,037 megawatts, which is, again, extremely substantial. That is enough to, no, I don't have that slide. That just those projects alone, which we put under contract in 2 years, is enough to power the 4 largest cities in upstate New York. So Buffalo, Rochester, Albany, and Syracuse. And so, again, when you put it in that scale, actually being able to accomplish that in just a couple of years is pretty exciting. And I think a big part of why we do think hitting these 100% targets is actually going to be possible. So distributed solar and energy storage, another big piece of the puzzle. We have a target of 6,000 megawatts of distributed solar by 2025. That's per the legislation as well. We're at just about 2,000 megawatts today, so we're actually a third of the way there, which is pretty good. And again, that'll have a significant impact on our power grid, enough to power 1 million homes. That's a very near-term goal as well, 2025. That's much earlier than a lot of the targets that I've been talking about. And that's because distributed solar is really ready for prime time today, can be easily deployed, is popping up all over the place, and certainly, something that more and more New Yorkers are seeing in their communities all across the state, which is very, very exciting. It has also again, come in at substantially lower costs than originally anticipated, and created substantial jobs as well. There are, I think, approximately 12,000 workers in the solar industry in New York State today. Energy storage, is kind of a piece of the puzzle to bring all of that together and to make sure that the grid will be not only able to integrate intermittent resources, but frankly more flexible and better operating than it is today. And so 3,000 megawatts of energy storage is the largest target in the country for deployment of energy storage. This is something that we really started kind of advancing in earnest just like less than a year ago, where there's a reference there to the $400 million in incentives that NYSERDA has put in place. We have seen strong uptake for that in a relatively short amount of time. And in fact, the queue of projects in the New York ISO interconnection queue for energy storage is at 5,000 megawatts today. So it's already in excess of our 2030 goal in terms of the number of projects that are being actively developed across the state. So this is really an example of a market that has taken off much more quickly than even we anticipated when we started on this, and we believe, again, will be an important part of the puzzle in our overall decarbonization efforts. Energy efficiency is going to be a critical driver of decarbonization, particularly, again, as we start to look beyond the electricity sector to building and vehicle decarbonization and beneficial electrification, making sure that we do make the electric system and our buildings as efficient as possible is going to be really foundational to building the system on top of that. So the recently, New York has essentially doubled our efforts around energy efficiency. That's what this 185 TBTU end use savings target means. It's a little bit hard to translate, but it does essentially represent a doubling of the budgets in the state for energy efficiency between now and 2025. And again, that's something that we are pushing hard, immediately to make progress on. Building electrification is an increasing focus of ours, and moving to high efficiency heat pumps, which I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with. Sometimes, you hear about geothermal or, air source heat pumps or mini splits. This is a very small part of the state's heating supply today, this so-called clean heating or electric heating, but it is something that we need to significantly ramp up in the years ahead. We are working on a number of initiatives and incentives to do that for residential, commercial buildings all across the state, as well as partnering with companies who are seeking to start to scale those solutions. We do think about it in some ways as trying to rerun a little bit the playbook that we've seen with distributed solar, where a decade ago we had very small penetration, and now have a mature industry that is delivering a very well understood by consumers and cost-effective solution. Those are some of the challenges we're going to have to get over, is having consumers understand these heating and cooling technologies, as well as making them more cost-effective compared to fossil-based, particularly natural gas heating solutions. And then, of course, reducing transportation emissions is going to be critical as well. So we have a number of programs. We are doing electric vehicle rebates, charging rebates. We're at just, to sort of benchmark it, we're at about 1% to 2% of new sales in New York are electric vehicles. It's been growing pretty rapidly. We've seen strong year-over-year growth of like 60, 70% over the prior year. However, that is, that's a tiny fraction of new vehicle sales. So we have an extremely long way to go. As another benchmark, I think California is far and away the national leader in electric vehicle sales, and they've exceeded at a high watermark 10% of new vehicle sales. So to actually get to, full conversion of the transportation sector to lower carbon solutions, whether they be electric or other types of technologies over time, is going to require a far faster pace of adoption than what we've seen so far. So this is a place where I think, candidly, we have a lot of work to do as policymakers and as a state in order to actually start to make progress and replicate some of the growth we've seen in renewable energy so far. Workforce development, I always like to talk about, because again, as exciting as these initiatives are, we can't actually deliver them without people. And the clean energy workforce in New York State is already extremely significant at approximately 160,000 workers. However, we do estimate that number will probably grow by approximately 100,000 additional jobs in the years ahead through the initiatives that we're talking about. It's an important part of the story for our state, and why being an early mover not only has benefits for our environment and our climate and the sustainability of our communities, but for our economy as well, and trying to squarely combat the false narrative that really has been demonstrated to be false in any of the jurisdictions globally that have been advancing aggressively in clean energy, that that renewable energy or clean energy comes at the expense of economic competitiveness. We are squarely aiming to put that notion to rest. So I did pretty good. I did exactly 30 minutes, huh? So like I said, that was very high level, and I know probably doesn't get to a lot of the more detailed questions you have, which I'm very happy to take. So, please go ahead.
I already saw several hands. Al, Peter,
Hi.
Hi. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Why not be bold, and why not just say there will be no buses sold in New York State that are not electric vehicles? There will be no taxis used in New York State that are, and give it a phase-in period.
Yeah.
It seems to me that one of the problems we have is the infrastructure isn't there for a lot of these things, charging infrastructure
Yeah.
and so forth and so on, grid infrastructure. If you mandate the use of electric vehicles, it's gonna have to happen. Well, why isn't that in the forefront, I guess is what perplexes me.
Well, I think there's always, it's a great question, and I don't think in any sense we would take something like that off the table. That may be part of the recommendations that come out of the work that the Climate Action Council will perform. Mandating things as opposed to incentivizing them, there's always this tension, right? And I would say from my perspective, having been working on trying to advance clean energy for virtually, all of my career, there is a pretty clear track record.
Mandated.
What's that?
Ethanol's mandated.
I know it is, and I wouldn't argue that mandates are necessarily ineffective. They are less politically popular, and we have seen tremendous public support for things like the clean energy targets, which are, like when you talk about 100% clean electricity, that concept polls extremely well across the country with all political parties, and creates a sense of buy-in of working towards something, whereas mandates in a lot of places they've been tried have been a little more controversial. Again, I'm not suggesting that that these two notions are like completely at odds with one another, because again, a target is a form of a mandate, and I think you're suggesting, so should we have 100% new bus sales by, 2030 or whatever the date is. I absolutely think we will be looking at that. There's certainly other jurisdictions that have done that, not in the U.S., but globally, that are looking at specific ban on internal combustion engines for passenger vehicles, for example, along some of these trajectories. So I think that's inevitable that will come, but as I said, in general, transportation has been less advanced from a public policy and public awareness kind of perspective. So that's like the work that we have to do. We have to really make up that ground relatively quickly. And in terms of the infrastructure, we do have a long way to go there as well. And it is a big driver of some of the anxiety consumers have about electric vehicles. So we are trying to work hard on that as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I have two questions related to kind of in-state and out-of-state, right? We're part of a larger economy. I'm wondering if you can say something about what will happen with imported electricity. So we import quite a bit now. And also, if you can say something about the greenhouse gas accounting sort of within state versus a life cycle approach. So for something like food or energy where things are coming in from out of state that are part of the whole picture.
Yeah, so the law does require that we set out some of those methods for that type of accounting, and we do have work ahead to figure that out. We do sort of greenhouse gas inventories today, and it is broadly across the economy and does account for import-export issues, but that our ability to get more granular in that analysis is going to need to come as we move into fuller scale implementation of some of these things. Specifically on the electricity import side, we do import a lot of electricity today. We do envision that there's a significant role for electricity imports going forward. We are a significant importer of Canadian hydroelectricity, for example, and would expect that needs to continue and grow over time. We haven't set a target for that in the same way we have for offshore wind, but again, without getting into the weeds of some of the process, we will be kicking off a detailed proceeding at the Public Service Commission next year, so shortly after the law takes effect, to get more detailed about how to meet the 70 by 30 and 100% by 40 targets, and that will necessarily take up the role of imports, clean imports, as part of our ability to hit those targets.
So I saw Jeff, Bruce, and Al. I see this.
Yeah, so I was wondering to what degree you plan on phasing out natural gas and natural gas infrastructure, because I assume you want to keep some around for flexibility on the electricity system, but to what degree do you expect to have to make things like natural gas boilers and other things sort of not allowable for purchase?
Yeah, I think that's one of the hardest and most significant questions that we're probably going to need to take up through some of these conversations, the Climate Action Council and the scoping plan and all of that. When it comes to the electric system and flexibility, we've tried very hard to both set some targets and some goalposts for things we want to incentivize, while leaving open the opportunity for other resources to compete and deliver. So, for example, if natural gas paired with carbon capture becomes cost competitive, faster than, other sources of that flexibility, like perhaps, most significantly, long duration storage is the one that I kind of think about. Will long duration storage get cost competitive faster than natural gas with carbon capture, and which one of those will be more of a factor when we get out towards, again, the last 20 or 10% of that 100% clean target and need to build in that flexibility. We have not foreclosed the role of natural gas in that way, but we have set the performance standard for zero carbon in the electricity sector, which I think we believe, based on best available literature and information today, is, again, that could be possible, but we don't know for sure. I think it's all a matter of, again, the cost is going to drive what that resource mix is going to look like at the end of the day. When it comes to, the other sectors like heating and hot water and all of that, I think, again, I think kind of similarly, we have not taken an approach as of yet for banning or eliminating those, but rather trying to really dial up our focus on alternatives. So, investing heavily in scale up of heat pump technologies, both, from a technology advancement as well as a soft cost reduction strategy. Again, the public education, workforce training, most home contractors that you would call to deal with these systems in your house today are not familiar with those technologies. We have a lot of work to do on training and education and awareness. And that's sort of where we sit today. As we get farther down those time horizons, that we'll have to assess how we're doing. And, if we're not getting, we're not getting where we need to be from an emissions reduction standpoint, then I think those conversations will definitely take on another perspective. It's going to be a challenging issue for sure.
Yeah. First. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I just wondered, New York State has a substantial budget deficit currently. Do you hear rumblings of your program being impacted by?
I have not. Have you? No, I'm just teasing. No, there is. I mean, the Medicaid deficit is significant impact to the state budget picture in the year ahead, for sure. The answer is no, in terms of, most of this is not funded through the state budget today. Just for clarity, a little bit of it is, but it's actually very small. Almost all of it is right now on your electric bill, which is different than the state budget. So. Yeah, so I don't anticipate that as a near-term challenge. I mean, in general, I get the question a lot. Would economic downturn or recession have an impact on our ability to keep advancing as aggressively as we have been? I think the answer, candidly, is probably yes. It would make it harder, but we're not forecasting that in this year and next year. We just have to sort of take that as it comes. What I would say again is that, what's been really interesting is that when you look at ratepayer impact. For some of these significant efforts, like the two offshore wind contracts we executed, which again is a significant amount of new electricity for a relatively early stage resource. Again, first of their kind projects in the U.S., meaning those will inevitably be the most expensive offshore wind projects that get built, and the next ones will be cheaper. That comes in at about 75 cents a month on the average residential electricity bill in New York, just to ballpark it. So it is not insignificant, in a total dollar sense. It's not also, though, something that I think it will be an impediment to progress in the short term, particularly given how low commodity prices are and the impact that has had on lowering energy bills in general.
Okay, so Al, Andrew, and then the person in the back. Actually,
When you build this infrastructure, everything solar cells, wind, people making conversions of their house to air source heat pumps, there's embodied carbon in that building those things. And I'm curious how or if it's included when you talk about carbon neutrality.
Yeah, so I think ultimately will be included. This is a place we're very eager for advancements in work and for education of ourselves as policymakers. The tools to actually be really clear about embedded carbon today are, still relatively early stage. We are using them in certain instances.
And they're in your estimates here too.
Yes, I mean they will ultimately, I think, be reflected better than they are today. But for example, we have a buildings competition where we funded recently a number of net zero new construction buildings, and we did ask those developers who are building new buildings to do an assessment of embedding carbon for those building projects as well. They're using certain tools, and we're trying to get familiarity with those tools to make sure that they're good enough to really rely on. So we're sort of, again, I think early stages in thinking about that, but it's absolutely part of what we want to do. And we also want to invest in, our opportunities to decarbonize some of these high embedded carbon parts of the energy sector, like concrete and steel and all of that.
Thank you.
Yeah, Andrew.
So you mentioned electric vehicles as like a means to decarbonize transportation. Is there any kind of push to improve the existing public transportation as like an alternate means? I don't know.
Yes, there is. I mean, I think, again, it's sort of hard in a short presentation to get into all of that, but it's interesting. Just by the numbers today, per capita, New York State residents have the lowest carbon footprint when it comes to transportation in the country because of the high population density in New York City that is served by transit. There's a clear correlation there between a lower carbon footprint and use of transit. We are working with the MTA in New York as well as transit authorities across the state to green their operations and to expand transit to a degree. I will say that does largely fall, beyond a little bit the scope of NYSERDA's funding programs, but the state is working on that. And you may be aware that New York passed congestion pricing this past legislative session as well, which is one of, I think, the 4 global cities now to implement congestion pricing, and that will serve as a significant new source of revenue to invest in enhancing the transit system in New York to continue making that possible.
Yes, the person in the back with yes.
So, I actually just read a very interesting article. There's this growing trend around the world of removing freight from highways and pushing it back onto the rail network, as well as electrifying that rail network. Almost every developed country is doing this. Great Britain is at 32%. This is at 1%. Railroads. And given the fact that we can use up to about 50% of federal highway money for transit and other types of transportation projects, do you see a conversation steering in that direction where we don't even have to necessarily implement additional pricing structures or any types of fundraising efforts?
Well, I mean, that's fascinating. I have to confess, I didn't know those statistics, and I will say it hasn't been a big part of the conversation that's been happening. I mean, hopefully that can be part of the scope of, for example, with the Climate Action Council as a subgroup on transportation, and hopefully those types of conversations will be a big part of it. It's unfortunate to hear those statistics. Not surprising in so many ways. The United States is behind Europe and other countries on a lot of these solutions. So that's a big part of the ground that we're trying to make up, and hopefully again, by moving on these conversations and these activities in New York, hopefully creating a little better awareness of the possibility that can exist for the entire country.
So it's already 5, but I think the conversation is so engaging. I think we all agree we're going to continue for another 10 minutes, right?
I won't be offended if you have to go.
I don't think that is a big female question yet. I think you have a little diversity.
Robbie. And the other one.
Appreciate that. So I've been studying public response to utility scale solar development across upstate New York, and so this question doesn't necessarily come from me, but kind of what I've been hearing from folks out there. And so I guess I'm just interested in hearing how you would describe the relationship between the CLCPA and how, if at all, that changes relationship with municipal home rule in terms of local siting regulation. You touched on briefly the long-term contracts that have been awarded for large-scale projects, and that the fact that they are under contract doesn't mean they've passed siting review.
Correct, yeah.
So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about that, and would you project that in places where utility scale projects are proposed that have passed local regulations that would not want those facilities to go through, does the CLCPA provide more power to the state to override those rules?
So I think in theory it does, and I don't know if everybody in the back could hear the question, but it is about the relationship between essentially, getting projects built and sited around the state and whether the state would overrule essentially local opposition. So I do think the CLCPA potentially contemplates that in the sense that it gives DEC very broad authority to enforce the requirements of the law. But what is more important, and you're probably clearly aware, is that already on the books today, the siting law known as Article 10 in New York State does have a state siting board that issues the final authorization for large generating facilities, that's more than 25 megawatts, and does contain a provision that has not yet been invoked to overrule local rules that are deemed to be unreasonably burdensome. That is a hot topic about whether, what's the right role of the state to either, overrule municipalities or not, and whether, we have to really retain the full force of home rule that has existed in New York State for quite some time. I personally think it's hopefully going to be somewhere in the middle. We're newer to the large-scale solar siting conversation. None of those projects have completed Article 10 review. So again, some of that is to be determined ahead of us through that regulatory process. On the distributed solar side, though, we have actually, we're a few years into this now. And what we saw initially was when New York State turned on the incentives for distributed solar development, there was a bunch of projects proposed all across the state, and a bunch of communities raised their hand and said that, not here, we're not sure what this is brand new. And we saw a raft of solar siting moratoria, local laws passed across the state. We have actually been successful in repealing a number of those just by, really investing in education and technical assistance to communities, going to those communities and saying, okay, we understand you don't want solar everywhere, but here's some tools to create a model bylaw that would allow you to site solar where you do want it. Here's also the benefits in terms of property tax payments you can get, and here's a calculator for what would be a reasonable compensation for like a pilot agreement. There's an information imbalance between a solar developer and a local official that's never heard of solar energy before, that's sort of saying, I don't even know if I can believe these people or not. So NYSERDA has been very aggressive getting around the state. Our team has met with 300 communities to talk about siting issues. And I think it has started to really bear fruit and be effective. It's hard work, and it takes a lot of time and investment. And I do think ultimately, personally, I think that's a more successful model than overruling local laws and sort of having the state mandate, the type of developments that communities should have. So we really do try to come at it from a, provide the incentive as opposed to, requirement. But again, we're going to have to monitor how that goes and how far we get. And if it starts to be a barrier, that may counsel for different approaches.
So, Shauna, we're happy, being in for a while, so we got all of it.
Thank you. So energy is essentially a demand-driven industry or business. So demand is determined by behavior, like where people live, where people work, like the transportation depends on where they live, where they work. So of course, this demand and behavior is affected by land use policy. So far, all these effort I saw here, we're mostly focused on supply side.
Yeah.
So, but in terms on the demand side, has the government, has your department thought about the land use policy? How can this energy policy pathway can be combined with the land use policy? Because I feel land use policy is really at the fundamental level driving everything, including energy behavior.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, land use, again, if you look at the carbon footprint for individuals residing in dense areas versus rural areas, there's a big difference there. It's a hard issue, though, again, in terms of a state requirements imposed on, local jurisdictions who typically have take up the role of land use planning. I think I don't disagree at all that it's going to be a fundamental part of the conversation. I don't think we're really mature in integrating those conversations. Your observation is certainly correct there. I do think, again, we try to provide incentives for certain types of development, but they really are, they're marginal compared to the impact that more comprehensive land use planning would deliver. I don't disagree. I think it's ahead of us. Jane?
So my town recently, they did this thing where they have the whole town purchase hydropower in one big block.
Yeah.
And I didn't know if that was a common practice, but
Yeah.
everyone's in it except if you opted out of
Yep.
it. And
So this is community choice aggregation, right? Yeah.
Is that something that's across New York State that we should do more of?
Yeah, so community choice aggregation. What town do you live in?
Town of Union.
Okay. And they've elected to purchase hydropower, which, in New York State, there is a pretty good base of installed hydropower, which is very cost effective and particularly, I think, really attractive to communities that want to move to, 100% renewable energy at, pretty affordable cost, because these resources are already installed, so they are lower cost than new wind or solar would be. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's like common across New York State, but it's certainly popping up in a number of areas. And there have been, I forget, I think, I want to say a dozen CCAs or something on that order of magnitude that have been approved across New York State. And it's certainly a model that's very prevalent in California and in some other states like Massachusetts. So I do think it'll continue to become more common. And it has the benefits, I think, for communities that want to take control of their energy costs. They also put the energy under contract typically for a pretty long period of time. You don't want to go too long because the market moves, but you can lock in your energy costs, and that makes it more predictable for, the municipality, let alone, homeowners to kind of predict what their energy costs are going to be. So it has a number of attractive benefits to it. And we do think that model can be a good vehicle to drive voluntary renewable energy purchasing that will help, accelerate our progress towards goals.
So for the right time, we need to have like lightning round.
Lightning round.
We start from Tito, and then then we go around.
Okay.
Great.
Are there any plans to incentivize hydrogen infrastructure?
Hydro infrastructure. Hydrogen, I'm sorry, thank you. We do support some R&D efforts around hydrogen historically at NYSERDA. We have not embarked on a broad scale type of support for hydrogen infrastructure. California is probably the farthest along in that regard. I think it's something we'll continue to evaluate, but honestly, it has not been. We have been more impressed by the possibilities around electrification for transportation rather than hydrogen fueling. But for certain applications, including heavy freight or maritime shipping and other, there clearly could be strong applications over time.
Quick.
Okay, yeah, no, I know that like nuclear accounts for it's pretty significant, but all those reactors are getting old now. And so you're gonna have to decommission them, right? So what are you gonna replace them with?
So there are a number of existing reactors in the state, one of which is retiring very shortly, one facility, Indian Point, which is probably well known to everyone. The 4 generators upstate are actually under license until almost 2030. So they are getting older, but they do have another decade of life under their current license. in terms of what happens after that, it's a pretty open question whether they can extend the useful life of those facilities safely and appropriately, or whether we will have to bring on other resources. And in that case, it would really be in the same category as everything else. We would be looking to clean resources, hydro, wind, and solar to make up the shortfall. It's about 17% of the state's electricity supply today. So it's big, but it's not 90%. It's noticeable. I don't want to downplay it. It's significant.
So then we're gonna have a quick
question. Yes. So I think Cornell has the aspiration of getting to carbon neutrality more quickly than the state.
That's right.
It would seem the perfect demonstration project for the state. I mean, so has there been any consideration given to partnering with Cornell to do this as an example?
We are partnering with Cornell extensively already and funding a number of the initiatives that the university is advancing, and we are certainly eager to see leaders like Cornell provide good models for others to follow, and are open to partnership opportunities on that. We were meeting with some of the teams today, and again, I think have funded a substantial number of energy efficiency and solar energy projects already for the university. But we all have a lot of work to do together ahead. So I think that's clearly possible.
So, quick question. So periodically the state prepares an energy plan.
Yes.
And it's required by statute. We're planning on participating in this year, which is 2020. Now, how does that interface with the climate action planning process? Is that going to supersede the state energy plan?
No, it's complicated. The climate action the CLCPA requires that the Climate Action Council develop the scoping plan, and that the next energy plan after that, which again will be past 2023, adopt the provisions of the scoping plan. We are, and we, I think, have not yet publicly announced it, but we are planning to do an energy plan update as an interim step very soon to try and reflect the goals that are in the law. But just if you read the two laws, the state energy planning law and the CLCPA, they don't match up really neatly. So that is, I think for the time being, we will use the energy planning process to update and keep current with policy, but I do think that the scoping plan through the Climate Action Council will become an initial fundamental document that is broader than the energy plan.
The states that lead in solar and wind are California and Texas. By far, they dwarf everybody else. Does your organization work with the people, your counterparts in those states, to say what is your recipe for success and bring those ideas right to the West Coast?
Yes, no, we do. I mean, I talk to my counterparties at the California Energy Commission pretty frequently. The recipe
How come they're doing so well?
Well, honestly, I think they started earlier, and California's leadership is what I think. So, a year ago, California passed SB 100, the first large state to commit to 100% clean electricity. There are now 8 states that have passed it. That's in just over a year. And New York was not too far behind California in that, but clearly California's leadership in sort of driving those models, no two ways about it. They are farther ahead than the rest of the country on almost all of this. The model in Texas is quite a bit different. It's really not driven by climate considerations, really has been driven by a different type of energy policy that is a very different regulatory regime than we have here in the Northeast and in deregulated electricity market states. So it's a little bit different, but yes, we follow closely what good ideas other states have, and I tell my team every day if there are other states doing good things, we should go steal those ideas and do them here.
That was my point. Yeah, borrow liberally.
Exactly. We don't have time to reinvent the wheel.
So I have a last question. We can have some offline discussion.
Yeah, just another contextualization. So how does the strategy for New York go forward in relation to what might or might not happen at the federal level in terms of federal policy, tax credits, and even in the longer term, like the possibility of some kind of carbon tax?
Well, so It's interesting. It's both really important and also not that important, depending on which way you look at it, right? So energy policy and environmental policy is fundamentally been driven at the state level for quite a long time. That's just the way it works. But there's no two ways about the fact that the federal tax credits have been a huge driver for the cost declines and cost competitiveness of renewable energy that allow, some of the progress that we're seeing. There has been a draft that was endorsed by both the Democrats and Republicans in the House just before Thanksgiving, a discussion draft for extending the renewable energy tax credits. I don't know if it'll go, but if anybody has any friends on those committees in Congress, please tell them. That would be a significant impact. By contrast, I get a lot of questions about the Trump administration and what they're doing and how much of a headwind that is to progress. It in some ways has been a little not that big a deal. We've still been able to make progress in a number of areas, but there are some pretty significant federal issues, and there's no doubt that if we had an administration in the federal government that was pushing forward, that all of this would be easier. The biggest one is really with the vehicle fuel efficiency standards and the battle between the federal administration and California and other states like New York that have signed on to California waiver around the rollback of those standards. That one is the one that worries me most in terms of the potential for the federal administration to do real damage to our efforts.
Okay, well, this is the longest and the most engaging Q&A session we ever had.
Thank you.
Before the conclusion, I do want to call John
Lochner is our
yes, you can do.
John Lochner is our Vice President for Innovation. I'm sorry, I should have introduced him at the beginning of the talk, and an important colleague for driving all of our R&D and commercialization efforts at NYSERDA.
I also want to thank Lindsay Anderson. I've been working with Lindsay to organize the trip. So thank you.